Our next session will shed light on the challenges the civil service faces at the federal and provincial levels in recruiting and skilling talent, and the best strategies to address those challenges in order to build a digital savvy public service. Joining us for this session, I'd like to welcome Dr. Wendy Sucure, Professor, Entrepreneurship and Strategy, and Director of the Diversity Institute with Ryerson University's Ted Rogers School of Management, Erica Vizzo, Acting Director General with the Canada School of Public Services Digital Academy, and Nicole Foster, Director of Global Artificial Intelligence, Machine Learning, and Canada Public Policy with Amazon Web Services. Nicole, I'll turn it over to you to get us started.
Thank you so much, Amanda, and I'm really pleased to be here today to moderate this topic. And it's a topic that actually Wendy and I have worked on together previously, and I'm delighted to welcome Erica to join this conversation with us today. And when Wendy and I first started talking about this a couple of years ago, there was already sort of this real quest to attract and recruit and retain digital talent, not just in the public service, but in the broader private sector as well. And of course, we've just gone through a pandemic. We're in the midst of a pandemic. It's not over yet, where we've all sort of spent a lot of time on platforms like this, and all of us have had to sort of pivot and become a lot more digitally savvy overnight for those of us who have done a lot of engagement in person. And so, of course, not just those of us who are individuals have had to do this, but organizations, both in the public and private sector, have really been forced to do that. And of course, now the latest news is that everybody is not looking just for digital talent, but talent, period. With a sort of growing labor shortage in a number of key sectors being experienced in a wider economy. So this is a hugely relevant topic, one that we certainly worked on for a few years, but it has become, I think, even more and more pressing in terms of this need. So I thought I would start off with the first question, Wendy and Erica, if you could just talk to us a little bit more about what we mean when we say digital skills. So what are we talking about when we are talking about digital skills? Wendy, maybe you want to kick us off.
Sure, and you know, this is something that I've been working on for quite a while. I've been a professor in information technology for many years before I switched to entrepreneurship. And often when we say digital skills, we think computer science, engineering, deep technology. But in fact, and those are important, there's no question. And I know Nicole certainly lives this every day, where there's huge competition for PhDs in machine learning and so on. Don't want to minimize those deep technology skills. But the fact is, when we're looking at digital transformation, deep technology skills are neither all that's needed or sufficient. We also need the ability to match technology to organizational requirements. And I'm not sure what research has been done recently in the federal public service, but certainly the OECD study that looked at businesses in Ontario, where everyone said digital skills top need. When I disaggregated the data, what we found is only 10% of people were talking about computer science and those deep technology skills. 15% were talking about what I would call sort of mid-range skills, where ERP, SAP, big data analytics, things that you can learn even if you don't have a computer science or engineering degree, but which do require specialized training. 75% who talked about digital skills were basically talking about Excel, Tableau, Microsoft Office, very basic level digital skills. And so we need to be precise, because if we're not precise, we often apply requirements to our job descriptions that then exclude people. And I would argue, for example, in the federal public service, there are a lot of jobs that are classified as computer science, which don't actually require a computer science degree.
And Erica, maybe does that align with sort of how you're thinking about it from the perspective of the Digital Academy and the kind of work that you're trying to do in terms of upskilling? Is that how you're thinking about it as well?
To a certain degree, Nicole and Wendy. So I really appreciate your description, Wendy, and I, really agree with you a lot. But I would add an extra layer. So we're not just talking about even those, you referenced Excel and SAP and those types of software that we'd want our public servants to know about. But for us in the Digital Academy at the Canadian School of Public Service, we're also looking at even softer skills than that are really about how you act and how you interact in a world, an internet era world, a world that is digitally enabled, where you can talk to your customer, to your Canadian who's looking for some service. You can talk to them by text message these days. So in the Digital Academy, the skills that we're looking to focus on, yes, some of them are technological, stimulated by technology. We're talking about cybersecurity or cloud first practices, that sort of thing. But some of the others are really those softer skills and competences that we want folks to think about in advance. So things like designing with users in mind, building in accessibility into your products and services, being transparent and open and collaborative in the ways that you work, good data stewards, making sure that you're considering privacy concerns, designing with users in mind. These are not even things that we would traditionally call like IT or computer science type skill sets, but they are skill sets of this modern digitally enabled world. So again, in the Canada School of Public Service, when we talk digital, I'm going to share a quote here with you that I really love by Janet Hughes. Digital isn't a list of things to do. It's about how you think, how you behave, what you value, and what drives decisions in your organizations. So I'd say those are the key elements we're trying to drive towards in the way that we're upskilling public servants. Not to suggest those other more tactile skills aren't necessary as well. Of course they are, but they almost don't get you anywhere in today's world if you don't have those competencies that you're thinking about at the same time.
Just to pick up on that, Erica, I mean, so AWS obviously has customers that are in every sector of the economy, public, private sector, you name it. Every organization is a technology organization. Now, there's really nothing that you can touch that is an entirely analog world anymore. And so one of the things that, when we were speaking to executives is really there's a need for that digital savviness in the C-suite, not just in the IT back office of the organization, because how you think in terms of technology is really how you operationalize your strategy for your organization. And so is that something that I think we see in the private sector very clearly? And is that sort of now kind of infiltrating into the executive level of the public service as well?
Absolutely, and not to throw anybody under the bus, but I will share that in some of our training sessions, some of the feedback that we get from our learners is, well, this is all great, and I would love to implement this going back into my organization, but my executive stack will never agree with it. They will, they'll never let me take that risk. They'll never let me explore that new idea. They'll never let me, practice that new way of working. So we are definitely seeing some blame being thrown around, if I can put it that way. But I don't think that the problem is that there is a lack of will. I think the problem is that it's almost like we haven't reached the moment of eureka in the public service yet to really realize that this is not something that is optional anymore. Like the train has left the station, and it's time for all public servants, employee level and executive level to understand these principles and to be putting them first. We need to be thinking about these things first and thinking about how to automate and simplify and reduce and focus on that user in anything that we're practicing, and not leaning on the way we've always done it, because that feels safest and most risk tolerant.
And so I'm going to jump to Wendy now, and just in the research that you've done in the past. I think one of the things that I thought was interesting is there was definitely some I think assets or strengths that the public sector has in attracting talent. that may be different from how we would think about attracting talent in the private sector, as well as some weaknesses. And maybe you can talk about just sort of how to think about those things, to think strategically about how you leverage your strengths and minimize your weaknesses when you're trying to attract technical talent or digital talent.
For sure. So I think in terms of attractiveness, and certainly for people of my vintage, the public sector was always attractive because of things like job security. And certainly for women, there were more advancement opportunities than in the private sector. Now, however, the private sector is competing for women. They can spell diversity and are much more focused on attracting diverse talent. So there's actually more competition, I think. One of the assets that the federal public service has, though, I think, in attracting young people is increasingly we know that, that younger people are very concerned about purpose and impact. And I think that one of the things, and we've seen a couple of departments use this in their outreach and their advertising, but I do think that really highlighting the contributions that the public sector makes in people's lives is actually something that helps sell those jobs in a significant way. I think the other thing, and this is something that's changed quite dramatically since we did our study with you, Nicole, is one of the pieces of feedback that we got was that a very important issue for young people, even almost as important as salary, was flexibility. Mm-hmm. And at that time, working at home, remote work, flexible work was anathema in many parts of the public sector. Because of COVID, suddenly those doors have opened up. I think that's a real selling point. I think some of the barriers, though, remain. Time to hire. If you're entering negotiations and you're competing with the private sector, and it's taking you 200 days to go from an advertisement to a contract, you're losing out. So I think there are advantages, there are disadvantages, but I think there's a real opportunity to not just focus on upskilling and building on the talent that you've got, but I think there's a real opportunity to kind of pivot a little bit to attract new talent using different messaging and different strategies.
You mentioned return to work, which is it's an obsession at the moment, actually. So we are, at Amazon and AWS, our corporate offices we're working from home until January, but January is coming pretty quickly, and I know a lot of companies are really. And organizations are really kind of not sure how to go about return to work. I think the instinct is we want to bring people back together and have that, the magic that happens in terms of collaboration and reconnecting with colleagues in the office. And I do fundamentally believe that that's true. However, a lot of people, particularly I think potentially women, are quite enjoying the flexibility of working from home. And I think companies are reconsidering their position and how to adapt themselves to that, because they're also very concerned about losing people when there is already a growing shortage. So, it's harder to find that talent. It's taking longer to hire that talent. We're losing people. And so that whole retention piece, I think, is becoming a real concern. And so in light of return to work, how could organizations think about it, how they can sort of adapt from what has happened and those digital skills to keep those people, I think, happy in their organization. In those organizations. And I don't know, Erica or Wendy, if you want to comment on that.
I think it's a great question, Nicole. And of course, like you said, it's the biggest question that everyone has. And, it's been a while. We've been waiting for the answer. It seemed like the biggest question in the first weeks after the pandemic, and yet here still it is. What I think has been really interesting over the last almost 2 years is that we've really shown that we can do it. And people have learned, employees have learned how to do the work. Managers have learned how to let go enough to let the employees do the work without the sense of needing to micromanage or that lack of trust that might have been really systemic before. So I think that we've shown that it can work and that we can continue it. What I imagine being an ideal, and I think this is what I'm hearing for a lot of areas of the federal public service, is that there would be some sort of hybrid in the future. And like for what that hybrid would look like for me, and you were bang on, Wendy, when you said that the parts that you're looking for, sorry, not Wendy, Nicole, the parts you're looking for when you get back to work is the collaboration and the magic parts. And that's what I'm really grabbing onto as well. Like I have found, and I still find that collaborating, doing that ideating and that whiteboarding and the really sort of smashing ideas together, that part is really challenging over the virtual distance. So I'm looking forward to a world when we can go back to work to do those parts. But the parts of our day that are the heads down work or the, long meetings, answering emails, all of that, I hope that we can still do that from home. And that will enable, like you mentioned, a lot of caregivers in the home, whether it's women or what have you. The caregivers really appreciate the ability to be home to take care of those needs of their families and their own dynamic. But then also, as you said, Wendy, the younger employees coming into the federal service these days, they really are looking for that flexibility. And I'm finding that new demographic, it's not a 9 to 5 that they're looking for anymore. They're looking for that 8 hours in the day whenever they feel like doing it during the day. So my hope and wish is that we can maintain that type of flexibility going forward. And I think it will make it more humane and easier for all of our folks.
In addition to that sort of flexibility that we've gained in terms of working from home, are there other changes that have happened over the last couple of years that have been triggered by the pandemic that you hope stick in terms of how people are able to work?
I can jump in on that. So I hate to admit this, but I've been working on the concepts of teleconferencing, telecommuting, teleeducation since 1979, when I worked with the Institute for the Future and then later with Dan Tapscott on a couple of his books. And since that time, we've been talking about how this is all potential, but management has typically been the biggest barrier. So I think that, just building on what Erica said, we have to continue, not let things revert to the way we did them before, but it requires skill. Like there are things that one needs to take into account if you're working in a hybrid organization around how you manage accountability and performance metrics, how you run a meeting, et cetera, that we really need to not assume that people will intuitively know how to do. So I think that's one thing that we want to keep these practices, but we can do better. I think the other thing that's kind of interesting, and I was on a panel, there are ways in which the electronic environments, though I take what Erica said, sometimes, you want to be in the same room with people, but there are some pathologies, particularly around inclusion and diversity, that creep into the workplace. There are 3 women on the call. I'm sure you know the echo chamber, where you say something in a meeting and no one pays any attention. Then a man says it and everyone goes, oh, what a brilliant idea. And so some of those, and we see the same thing with people from certain cultures. We know that persons with disabilities often feel excluded. We know that Indigenous people in particular have different styles of communication, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there are actually new, in my view, opportunities to create more inclusive kinds of group communications where it isn't just the birds of a feather, the people who went to, the same Ivy League public policy school, reinforcing each other's worlds. And we know that in this environment, we're also creating more opportunities for many people, not just women, but people with disabilities who historically have said the number one thing they need is the ability to have more flexibility. So I think that's something that we should, especially given the federal government's commitments around equity, diversity, and inclusion as we build back better, embedding that's critically important. But the other thing that I think is also something we need to really hang on to is that not only has COVID kind of made us far more aware of inequality and that we have to respond, but it's also really focused attention on mental health and healthy workplaces and making that far more central and intentional in our workplaces. And I think that's actually really, really important. And you know, our research shows that, again, from a mental health perspective, COVID has had differentiated impacts, but that discussion around mental health in the workplace has really become front and center, and we shouldn't let that go.
Nicole, if I could jump in, I wanted to add, Wendy, we were just totally on the same wavelength there when you know, the question was about what have we seen during COVID that we'd like to see continue, you know, if and when the pandemic kind of ends. And the thing that I wanted to add, and it ties in really nicely with what you were speaking about, Wendy, is the diversity of geography that we now have because of you know, remote enabled digital way of work. We can bring in employees from all different areas of the country. And I've just been so thrilled to have that kind of diversity around the table. It's a different kind of definition of diversity than you know, is traditional in the way that we speak about diversity. But for a public service employee to actually be able to hear voices at the table from all provinces and all provinces and territories and, you know, areas of our country, I think that's incredibly important. So that's the big benefit that I have seen through COVID that I hope will continue. But it links right in, Wendy, as you were saying, to inclusion and diversity. Also, though, the other part that has taught me about inclusiveness as someone who's working with teams now that are completely distributed, it's taught me a new management skill that I struggled with before. And, you know, in the past, I've had sometimes one or maybe two employees that were outside of the National Capital Region, and it felt really challenging to know how to integrate them equitably into the conversation and how to make sure that their voice was heard and how to still do team building events that included that one person who was in Halifax. And now, you know, now we've figured out how to do that kind of you know, making sure that everyone's at the table and they have an equal voice, no matter where they're coming from. So I think it's a new lens on inclusivity and diversity that has been a really interesting addition to our workplace during COVID.
No, I think that's super important. And of course, it does, you know, frankly, Toronto is far more diverse demographically than Ottawa is, may not have the same access to francophones, but we know that 50% of Indigenous people live on reserve and in the north. We do have issues, although, with access to infrastructure, which is why the federal government's high-speed internet strategies are so critically important to support the kind of democratization and access both to employees working as well as to people you're serving. But I agree with you 100%. It's broken the idea, in my view, that to work with the federal government, you have to go to Ottawa.
Mm-hmm. And then if we want to just hone in again a little bit more specifically around digital skills and the need for those particular skills in the public service, Wendy, I did want to reference a report that you've published on building inclusive workplaces. And you do talk a little bit about how that there is tech skills there, but that there are other barriers that aren't considered. And maybe I can just invite you to talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. And I think that it's not that Eric and I disagree, except probably because of the work we're doing with the Future Skills Center and Skills for Success, we're quite preoccupied with sort of taxonomies and precision around competencies. So I agree 100% that for digital jobs, you need more than digital skills. But when we define digital skills per se, we probably keep them a little narrower. And then we think about change management, entrepreneurship, change skills. We think about communication skills and so on. So I think, you know, for me, what's really important, and maybe it's a function of my age, is that we need to take an asset-based approach, particularly if we're looking at upskilling and reskilling our existing employee base. And let's face it, the federal public service has a lot of complexity to it. Moving into a policy-driven environment to roll out a service is very, very different than, you know, setting up a platform to sell, you know, health and beauty products or something. And the decision-making processes, not that they're perfect, but the ways in which decisions are made, the influence of policy, the commitments to the community, there's a lot of institutional knowledge that people who are not digital natives have that is incredibly valuable. And you want to make sure you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And you look at how you could take someone who has that knowledge and that expertise and that experience, and how you can add to what they have with respect to digital skills. And, you know, we've run programs that are very much focused on taking people without technology backgrounds and transitioning them into systems development platforms, to data analytics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we have to be careful to recognize that that the competencies that are required to be successful in the federal public service in driving and supporting digitization go far beyond what we would never narrowly describe as those technology issues. And moreover, you often have people with great, deep technology skills who, you know, as Erica intimated earlier, may lack an understanding of what the technology is actually to be used for. And I've seen lots of examples of big projects going way over budget, way over time, because people were in love with the technology and didn't have the attention to what it was actually supposed to be doing. And you know, people talk about technophobia as being a real impediment to organizational performance. Technophilia is equally damaging when people start to fall in love with technology for its own sake. And especially when we start to get into complex areas like using artificial intelligence and big data analytics and so on. There's a lot of complexity in the decision-making, the design processes, the implementation around some of these things that require wisdom and knowledge, not just a computer science degree.
Yeah, so it's that governance piece. So just to summarize a little bit some of what you were saying, there's a strategy around in terms of thinking about digital skills and having a broader definition about how you define that and where you can find a mix of skills to build a team that is working on a digital project. Another sort of strategy that we use a lot in the private sector, this is a diversity plank as well as just being a skills, sort of a drive for skills, is international recruitment. You know, in terms of return to office, one of the things that we've been thinking about is that, you know, forcing people to come to Vancouver or Toronto could be a barrier. But actually, if we're looking at international recruitment from other parts of the world, that could actually be a huge advantage, is that you're bringing people to Toronto or Vancouver or, you know, Calgary, or, you know, there's actually a potential for that to be an incredible magnet for high technical talent. But I think, Wendy, you've identified that is not necessarily a strategy that's been very successful for the public sector.
Yeah, and it's, you know, it's interesting, and you would know, Nicole, that in the IT sector, newcomers and racialized people in general are overrepresented for exactly those reasons. But I would argue, and, you know, I'm not in the federal public service, but often there are barriers like the security clearance. You know, we were trying to help transition some people into a program. They needed to have been a citizen for 10 years. So quite apart from French and English competencies versus other languages, which, you know, in some parts of the country are growing in importance. Some of the requirements, I would argue, may pose unintended barriers, especially to newcomers. And of course, there are parts of government where security clearance is critical. But I've had to pass security clearance to write a report on diversity and inclusion. Doesn't make a lot of sense. So I think there are opportunities to reconsider where some of these requirements make sense and where they don't.
So that's, I mean, we've been talking a lot about the sort of recruitment pipeline as a way of increasing sort of the digital skills in the public service. Erica, maybe you want to talk a little bit more. I would love to just hear, do you find that there's a ravenous appetite for digital skills, or do you have to like work hard to kind of hook people in? Is there a type of person that seems more excited? Can you talk a little bit about sort of how that's going?
Yes, I can. And I regret to inform you that it's not the good news story that maybe you're looking for. We do actually find that I wouldn't say it's a tough sell, but it's tough to communicate in. The federal public service is huge. And we're finding that we're meeting only a fraction of those public servants in our learner base. I think that we're at a little bit of almost, we're almost before the wave. For the wave I'm referring to in this point in time is employees realizing that they themselves need to be responsible for their own upskilling, and that they need to be responsible for their own career development and career path. And I think there's a little bit, I mean, there's always these jokes about how the government is 10 years behind the times. And I think there is still a little bit of that lingering, and where a lot of folks can figure that they can do their jobs as they've always done it until they retire. And so why am I going to bother learning any new skill sets? There is that attitude, and we do have to work our way around it and figure out how to slice into those individuals and convince them that this isn't, like I said before, the train has left the station. Like, you can't wait it out. It is happening now. And if you don't adjust and modify and be able to be part of these conversations, then you're not going to get the chance for advancement. You're not going to get to be assigned to that project. There's all sorts of opportunities that will be lost. And Wendy speaks about bringing in new public servants that have these skill sets that we're looking for, and that is absolutely essential and critical to renewal of our employee base. But we can't forget about the folks that we've already committed to. And so it's really, it's equally as critical that we are taking the skill sets that we have built up in these individuals. And Wendy mentioned earlier, the years of policy knowledge that they can have, or the years of understanding the machinery of government, or how ATIP works, or whatever it is. That is massively important to the stability of our service offerings. So what we need to do is help them finish their skill sets and bring them into that new realm. So like I said, it is a little bit of a challenge. It is one thing I think that we are a little bit surprised about in the Canada School of Public Service, because we did think that if we built it, they would come, but we've built it and they're not quite coming. So we are really trying to up our communications campaigns and really clearly explain what it is, what these skill sets are that we're trying to introduce into the public service. And I'm just going to say one last thing about that. And it goes back to your first question, Nicole, about what is digital. I think that we actually have a bit of difficulty around that word. And you can hear that Wendy and I talked about it a little bit differently. Public servants themselves understand it differently as well. And we hypothesize that many see the word digital and think that it means information technology, it means coding, it means, CS classification. So they think, oh, well, that's not about me, I don't need to know that. Whereas the CSs, they see the word digital and they think, oh, that is about me and I know everything already. So we are hypothesizing that we're kind of missing the mark perhaps in our terminology, even though this is terminology that is standard in the world. So that remains to be seen. We are exploring a bit of a different use of lingo. We're certainly starting to talk about modern government a little bit more and digital transformation to bring the learners to the understanding that we're talking about more than just those IT competencies.
I learned a new word recently. It was pedagogy, and it was a totally different context. It was in the context of teaching artists how to be entrepreneurs, that artists did not think of themselves as business people when most of them, frankly, are small business people and need kind of those marketing skills and promotional skills and, basic accounting and all of that. And working with a long time ago, working with an arts organization on how they had to completely invent a new vocabulary around the importance of those business skills to help artists be self-sustaining. And it sounds a little bit of a sort of similar translation needed. I can just share that when I go to speak to a lot of senior officials, elected and unelected officials in government, I have to start with explaining what the cloud is and what AWS is before we can talk about how to govern emergent and regulate emerging technology. So I think people get freaked out by I don't know how technology works.
Yeah.
I don't know how these things work, but I understand how what it is and how we can govern it and the governance around it. And
it's the same as your cell phone. You couldn't build one, you couldn't code one, but you know what its purpose is for you, and that's the type of general basic understanding we need to ensure that every public servant has.
Yeah, and I think.
Sorry, I was going to say just 2 quick points. I think we've done a review of successful digital transformation projects, mind you, in the private sector, not the public sector, but places like AT&T that reskilled 50% of their workforce. And the thing is, it has to be an intentional strategy that is driven from the top. You can't expect the School of Management to pull people in if there isn't the structure in place to make it clear. And, one of the tricks we've used is instead of calling it this or calling it that, call it leadership. It's the same thing with EDI now.
Absolutely.
It's about leadership. You want to be a leader, you need to know this stuff. Yeah. So that's one point. The second thing, and I will sound parochial because I am in a business school, but the second thing is that I would observe that a lot of the people my vintage-ish in the public service hire in their own image. So if they graduated from one of the cushy public policy schools, that's where they go for their interns. That's where they go for their hiring, their recruitment, and so on. Public policy schools, and I teach in one, are not necessarily moving into this space in an appropriate way. I would argue now it's not sufficient to understand policy creation processes, et cetera, et cetera. You need to understand project management. You need to understand finance. A friend of mine became assistant to the Minister of Finance in Ontario, and never in her experience had been exposed to government budgeting processes. You need to understand service delivery. You need to understand a lot of these things that are far more tied to translating policy into practice and then evaluating its impact and building those feedback loops for innovation and so on. Then the traditional theoretical, public policy 101 stuff that's taught in the schools. And all I would say, and this would be just one of my pitches, is if the federal public service in recruiting students doesn't make clear to the post-secondary institutions that some of the kinds of skills that business students get, for example, or technology management students get, for example, or entrepreneurship students get, for example, are critical to the next breed of public service, it's just going to replicate the old systems.
Welcome, Amanda, and thank you, Erica and Wendy, for a great conversation.